Hey guys, and welcome back. Today we're talking about Headscale, but before we get into that, I'm going to talk to you about its bigger brother, Tailscale. I'm going to tell you about how the two are intrinsically linked. I'm going to tell you how it includes WireGuard, which we've touched on in previous videos. We're going to talk a little bit about what's actually going on with Headscale and why you might want to use it. And then I'm going to get into the config, and we're going to go ahead and deploy this on our own home lab. So you're all probably familiar with Tailscale. Now, Tailscale allows you to set up a VPN and create a mesh VPN network. Now, this is different to your traditional hub and spoke model, like we did in my previous WireGuard video, where we set up a WireGuard server on our home lab, and that allowed us to connect individual clients to that server and have access locally. Now, Headscale and Tailscale, and I'll get onto that link in a moment, they allow you to effectively create multiple VPN breakout points on your network. So every device you add into the Headscale mesh can actually also be a breakout. So let's say you have two people, a friend in their house. If you want to share their network and your network together, you can do that in Headscale. They may have services that they want you to have access to, and vice versa. That will allow them to access your services, and that'll all be routed through WireGuard over a VPN. So just rewinding, what's Headscale, what's Tailscale? Well, Headscale is simply an open source implementation of Tailscale. Now, Tailscale is great. Lots of people use it, but there's one fundamental issue, potentially, with being able to fully trust it. And that is that the traffic is routed through Tailscale's network. Now, Headscale fixes that by actually deploying the server, i.e. the bit that is hosted by Tailscale, on your own infrastructure. So you don't have any dependency on Tailscale. They are not seeing any of the traffic that's routed to your network. And the great thing is, because it's using the same protocol, we can actually use the Tailscale app that's on many different distributions of operating systems and mobile phones, and we can access our home server using it. This makes it not only secure and private, but also familiar to use with readily available tooling. Now, this video has taken a while to set up because some of the documentation is a bit lacking in areas, but I've persevered and I've got the config files for you, and hopefully this will work on your end as well. So in a high-level overview, without getting into too many of the technicalities and trying to use some analogies that make it simple to understand, there's a few key processes that we need to do in order to set up and get working with Headscale. The first is we need that server. So that's the bit that traditionally would be hosted on Tailscale's end, and that's what we're looking to deploy here, so we can remove that dependency on a third party. Now, we're going to be deploying this in Docker, but there are binaries available for both Windows and Linux, so you can choose an operating system that suits your needs. Now, this server is basically the brains of the operation, and it's where all of your clients, again, those can be a mobile device, those can be a laptop, a computer, whatever you want. Those connect to this server and are then registered on the server. So, what you need to do is configure the server, and it will be routed over HTTPS. You can then connect to that server with a client, and it's going to give you a registration number. Now, you need to have access to your server to be able to register that device. Now, that's obviously good because you only want to give access to people that need it. Once you've registered a device, it's then recognized by the server, and you can complete this process for all of your devices or all of the people that you want to give access to. Once those are established, there's a further step. So you can add these to namespaces, which groups those devices into handy groups. And so you can set explicit rules based upon groups. And as I've just alluded to, you then set up routes within Headscale. So you can specify which routes you want active, i.e. which of the nodes, and as I mentioned earlier, each of the nodes within this mesh can be used as an exit point. So some of those devices, you might want to allow other devices to have access to their local networks, or you might not want to do that. Maybe it's a device on a secure network and you don't want to share that access. Oh, and whilst we're going to be doing all of this through the command line interface, there is also a handy UI that's been developed, and you might want to start off going down that route. So I'm going to include those configs as well. So for this video, I'm going to show you how to set up the Headscale server. I'm going to show you how to connect a mobile Android client. It should be the same for iOS. And finally, I'm going to show you how to deploy another client within Docker. And that will give us access between both the external mobile phone and the internal Docker client, and both of those should be able to access their respective networks. So if we head over to my GitHub page, I've included the configs that you're going to need to spin this up. And these are tailored to some of the setups that I've been doing in my video series, but it should only require some minor tweaks to get it up on your system. Plus, I'm going to reference the official documentation down in the description below. So looking on GitHub, we've got the Tailscale client. We're going to need that later on when we try and connect one of our Linux machines to our server. We've got the Docker Compose file that sits behind a reverse proxy so that you can use HTTPS with a valid certificate. And I've got the Docker Compose file here just for sort of a debug setup where we're going to make sure that we have everything deployed, but it won't be using a valid certificate. So jumping into the basic one first, we can see that it's quite straightforward to set up. We need to give it a couple of volumes. The first one is where we're going to store the config file, and the config file we'll be obtaining from the official GitHub repo. The second one is where it's going to store the keys, but also its own database. And we'll create that database in a moment. Now, before you get too scared, it's easy. We're just creating a SQLite file, which is a single command. We don't need to deploy any more containers. We're going to specify some ports. So 8080 is the default port that it's going to listen on, and 9090 is used for metrics. Now, make sure you change those in case you've got any port conflicts. The other important part here is the command. Now, this needs to be here to make sure that the Headscale container is set up to serve as a server. The final container here is the web UI. Now, I'm not going to go into detail on that in this video, but it should be pretty straightforward to get that up and running. And I've included the details in the description below, so go ahead and look at that. As I said, this video we're going to focus purely on the command line interface because it's important to understand exactly what the commands are and how this works, because after all, this is a hole into your network. If we quickly look at the traffic configuration, that's basically the same, just with those traffic labels. Now, when you're setting this up, one of the key things to bear in mind is that you may get CORS issues. Now, these are cross-origin issues, so when you're trying to access one domain from another domain, it throws a security message. So when you deploy this, you want to make sure that both are using the same subdomain. Otherwise, you're going to have to put some CORS headers in your traffic file. I don't have time to get into that in this video, but I'll leave a link in the description below. So let's go and jump into deployment now. Okay, so I've gone and created my Docker Compose folders. I put the respective Compose files into those folders. And now we need to create a few folders where we're going to mount this container before we deploy it. So to do that, let's have a quick look at the official instructions and see what we need to do first. So we need to create a couple of folders, and we also need to create a blank database file. So let's go ahead and do that following the structure that's outlined on the instructions. So I've now created the two folders that we need. You can do that through the command line or just use WinSCP. Next, we need to create our blank database file. Now, as I said, that's really straightforward. We simply need to type touch space db.sqlite, and that will create a blank file with that name. So we can run that command and then validate it within WinSCP, and we can see that the file is there. The last thing we need to do before we can run this is to actually clone the config file and tweak it for our setup. Now, I simply headed over to the GitHub page, copy and pasted these, but you can run a wget command if you want. Thankfully, within the config file, there isn't too much that we need to change because, as I'm doing, I put this behind a reverse proxy. So all of the TLS settings I can just leave blank, which is the default. If you're wanting to expose this directly, there are separate instructions for how to create certificates within this application itself. You can find those in the official documentation, but it's pretty straightforward, especially if you've seen my traffic video before. So for my setup, I simply need to change the server URL and the listen address. So I've just changed my server URL address to be my domain with a Headscale subdomain. Now, it doesn't need a port, it's going to run on 443, which is great. And the other change I've made is that the listen address, I've changed it to 0000. That means because it's in a Docker container, it's going to listen to all interfaces. And that should be all you need to change to run this behind an external proxy. So to fire this up, we're simply going to deploy it as we have all of our other containers. Let's navigate to where the Docker Compose file is and do a sudo docker compose up-d. So now that that's deployed, we can go and validate that using Portainer or just execing the logs, whichever you find easier. I like Portainer, it makes life simple. So looking in Portainer, the containers are up and running. That's good news. Let's hop into the logs to see what's happening in Headscale. You can see that the first time I've run this, there weren't any private keys, so it's gone and generated them. And those are the keys that it will use to encrypt that traffic on your Headscale mesh network. You can see that it's listening on the ports that I specified, and there aren't any error messages other than the TLS message, but we don't need to worry about that because my proxy is going to be terminating those SSL connections. So if everything's working, we should be able to hit the URL you specified for Headscale and / Windows at the end. Now, if you just hit the default URL, i.e. headscale.jimsgarage.co.uk, it won't display anything. And that's expected behavior. It's not designed to show anything on that page, it's just designed to be reachable. If you actually go to your URL / Windows, it's going to give you some instructions to show you how to connect a Windows client. Now that might not be useful, but at least it shows that it's up and running. So if I go to the URL that I specified in the config file and do the / Windows and hit return, you can see that we're granted with that page that I mentioned, which gives you all the instructions you need to then go and connect a client. You can also see that I've set up the Headscale UI, and we could go in there and configure Headscale through here if we wanted. I'm not going to do that, I'm going back into the CLI. So if we jump into the command line on the Headscale container, let's just check a few things. What we're going to check is what routes are available and what nodes are available. So they should be 0 because we haven't configured any. Now that's as simple as doing Headscale, nodes, list. There aren't any nodes. And we can do Headscale routes list, and again, that should be blank because we don't have any nodes, therefore we don't have any routes. So let's go and solve that. The first thing we're going to do is deploy this on our mobile phone, because I imagine most of you want to do that. But the same process applies for desktops, laptops, VMs, whatever you're running. So head on over to the Android App Store or iOS and download the Tailscale client. Now when you fire up the app, you're going to make a few changes. So typically it's going to ask you to sign in with Google or an other. Now we don't need to do that obviously because we're not using Tailscale's infrastructure. Instead, you need to tap the 3 dots 3 times. And when you do that, on the 4th tap, it's going to ask you to change server. Now this is the bit where you can specify the URL that you put in your config file. So for me, it's https://headscale.jimsgarage.co.uk. Now, if this goes well, it should come up with a message and a code. And once you've hit sign in with other, you're going to be presented with a machine registration page. Now, we need to get this code and register it within our machine. To take a copy of this and head on back over to your Docker container. So one thing you want to do first is to create a user. So this is the user for my phone. So I've just called that Android. I've gone ahead and created it. Now we can paste in the key and the command that was given to us in the Tailscale Android app. So here you can see I've specified the user as being Android and I've pasted that key. So let's go and hit return. Now it's saying machine Pixel 6 Pro has been registered. Excellent. Let's hop back to the phone and just validate that. So now back on my phone, we should be able to exit out of this page. And then we can see in the app, we now have my Pixel 6 Pro and it's saying that it's active. So that's great. It's showing that it's working. So if we actually touch the three dots, we can run this as an exit node. So that means that other devices on the network can access this machine and can actually exit and connect to things on this network. Now, as this is a mobile phone, that's not really going to work. But if it was another machine, for example, on a different network, it would give you access to all of those services around that computer. So let's go ahead now and deploy the Tailscale Docker container, which will allow us to add another node to our network. This will then allow our Pixel 6 Pro to connect to that machine, and because that's in my home lab, I can then access services on my network, like my Pi-hole for example, and it's going to behave exactly like the WireGuard VPN we set up in a previous video. So to begin to deploy our Docker container running Tailscale and add this as another client, we need to add the user first. I've just called this one Docker. Now we've got that user created, we can generate an authorization key, and we'll pass this authorization key to our Docker Compose file, and when that spins up, it will do the automatic registration, much like we just did with the Android app, although it's going to be automated. So this command here is going to create a pre-authorization key for my user, Docker, we've just created, and it's going to set an expiration for 1 hour. That means you've got an hour to spin up your container. So there's the key. We want to take this key, copy it, and then we're going to put this inside our Docker Compose file for our Tailscale. I showed this earlier. So in this part here, just paste that key. We'll just have a quick look at what this is actually doing first, because there's some extra arguments in there that are important, but they're pretty straightforward. We want to specify the server. Again, this is the same one that we just used for our Android app. We want to advertise this as an exit node, so that means other devices on the mesh network can exit and access items, access networks within that network. We want to advertise its root, so i.e., yes, it can use this as an exit node, but it can only use these IP addresses. Now that's most of my home network, or at least the critical services I run, and it's going to accept DNS. So let's go ahead and run this. So great, that container started. Let's hop back into Portainer and just double check what's going on in there. And in the Tailscale logs, that looks good. Let's head over to the Headscale ones. Ignore those failed authentication. I made a typo before I made this video. But as you can see here now, client sent endpoint update, we're okay. Let's go and validate that now in the command line interface. So now we can see that we've got two nodes. We've got my mobile phone and we've got the Docker machine we've just registered. Brilliant. We can also now see the roots. So we can see that both of those have roots available, but none of them are enabled yet. So that means whilst it can see it, it can't send traffic over it. So let's go ahead and enable that with the following command. So now if we check again, we can see that on my mobile phone, those roots are enabled. So other devices can now reach and go out through my mobile phone. Let's do the same for the Docker container. And if we head back to my mobile phone, we can see the container that we just added. It's docker.dockerexample.com on here, but you can call it whatever you want. Now, the key thing is we can click on that, you can copy its address, etc. We can also hit the menu on the phone, and we can say where we want to exit from. So we could say we want to allow LAN access, we could say none, or I could choose to now route out from that Docker container, which is great if I want to change my IP address, i.e. my internet IP address, so I could route out from my home network and have the protection of my firewall and all the other features that I've got on there, as well as using all my services like Pi-hole, like Plex, things like that. So I've gone ahead and selected to use the Docker as my exit node. This should now let me use my internal services. So let's go and validate that. So if I open up a new tab and I go to Pi-hole, and there we go, I have access to my Pi-hole, which isn't available externally to the internet. So we know that it's working. That's great. And there we go. It's working as intended. We now have Headscale set up and configured with multiple clients. We're able to define specific rules. We're able to specify which exit node we want. And so you can go and add as many clients as you want, share these with your friends, family, etc. Or if you're in the enterprise space, then it's pretty clear how cool this technology is. If you had multiple sites, you could use this to route those sites, define what access controls you want them to have, as well as lots of other possibilities. So now, instead of just having your single hub and spoke model, like we did in the previous WireGuard, you now are able to set up groups, route traffic where you want, and arguably, you're able to share this more easily. I know for a fact I'm probably going to be using this for remote IT support with my family. I'll probably get a Raspberry Pi or something like that, stick it in their network, and it's going to give me access to their machines pretty easily. So thanks for watching. This video took a long time to figure out thanks to some of the documentation. Hope you enjoyed it. Please like, subscribe, and put a comment down below. Take care.